Hi, my name's Colleen Gallagher. I am a customer success engineer here at Tines, and I'll be walking you through the Workbench Bootcamp. So the Workbench Bootcamp will focus on a vulnerability management use case, highlighting Workbench. If you're not familiar with Workbench, it is an AI chat interface powered by Tines Workflows. And the value add of that is not only can you pull data from across your tool sets in one place, you can also take action on that data. Now, the story today will focus on searching for vulnerabilities in hosts, formatting, visualizing that data, enriching, and then creating an email or a case, depending on if you are working the Bootcamp tenant live or if you are following the self-paced with your own tenant and maybe don't have cases enabled. It's a good idea to have the guide up alongside to reference. And make sure you're logged into your tenant. So before we get into it, I like to level set with some terminology. Actions are the building blocks of Tines stories. We have 8 of them. Stories are synonymous to playbooks, automations, etc. And we call those stories, and where we build the storyboard. Events are the data that pass through these actions and stories, and they are in JSON with key value pairs. Pills are like variables. They reference data dynamically. That could be credentials for API keys to authenticate requests, or it could be resources, or most commonly upstream data. And then lastly, API is what makes Tines so great, is that there's an API we connect to it. Okay. So now we're going to switch into our tenant or the tenant you'll be building in, whether that's bootcamp.tines or your own community edition tenant, etc. You'll want to make sure, again, if you're not following on live, you're following self-guided, you'll want to have this story imported into your tenant called bootcamp-tines.workbench. You can import this from the story library. And we'll get a lay of the land here. So on our left-hand side, we have our actions, as I mentioned, the building blocks. We have webhooks for receiving data from other tools, HTTP requests for sending and receiving data from other tools, receive and send email actions for natively sending and receiving emails, our AI action, which is our newest, also leveraging, as noted, AI, LLMs, providing a prompt to get formatted data or make decisions or summarize, normalize, etc. Event transforms, primarily used for data transformation, data parsing, but they also have many other modes like delaying, exploding, imploding, deduplicating, and our newest mode, automatic, which again is also leveraging AI. But instead of at runtime, it's during build time, and you provide a prompt that will translate into Python to be executed. Now, with all our AI features, I like to remind everyone that the AI runs on AWS. It's all tenant scoped and no data is logged or used for training. Now for triggers, that is like our gatekeepers. You configure rule sets. So if this is true, pass down stream. If it's not, do not pass or go down the no match path. As you'll see here, the dotted line, no match path. Our send a story. So send a story, we don't talk a lot during our bootcamp sessions, just because it's more advanced functionality. Essentially, it's a way to build more modularly. So if, let's say, for example, if you're familiar with the concept of functions, you can reference a story from another story. And that'll be particular to what we talk about today, because the way we enable Workbench stories will be similar to how you enable Senda stories. So tools, we have pages, provide a front-end user interface, and display data in a story to make it feel more like apps. We have a bootcamp dedicated to that as well that will dive more into that. Records, native database for Tines, run script for executing Python, cases, native case management, which we'll touch on today, groups for grouping, visually grouping actions, and then notes for annotations. And then we have templates. So that's our pre-configured HTTP request actions for a lot of popular tools. Just search for the tool, drag and drop, and go from there. And then our story library, which is pre-configured stories, a lot of different use cases, a lot of different tool sets you can import directly into your tenant. Okay, so let's get a lay of the land or an overview of what the story is doing. Kicks off with a webhook where Workbench will pass in data to be processed in the story. There's a trigger to check the query, whether we're looking for a specific CVE or all open CVEs. We have the request to CrowdStrike to look up either all open or one specific CVE across hosts, check if any are found. If so, continue on, explode each of the vulnerabilities, gather more host information, build the results, implode, and send back. There are no results, send back no results. Now again, on the right-hand side, we have our configuration panel. So when it's not clicked on an action, you get the story level configuration details. When it's clicked on an action, we'll see the action level configuration details. And another thing to note, all of our HTTP requests are mocked simulated data. So we're not actually calling out to a CrowdStrike environment, but rather mimicking what interacting with that with CrowdStrike would look like. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to begin enabling the story for Workbench. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera to give more space here. Okay, so that's going to be on our story configuration details on our right. So if we scroll down, it's going to be under send a story, because again, send a story and Workbench are set up the same way. We're going to define our input and our output actions. So for input, it's always going to be a webhook. It's always going to be one webhook. And that's either gets triggered by another story or Workbench. And we're going to choose input, which is the only webhook action we have here named input. Once we set that, we see some send to story input. So this is the input data that we're passing. And this helps Workbench know and provide more context of what Workbench should pass into the story. So we have one set up, and that's query. So the query parameter that first trigger is checking. We're checking if we're looking for all open CVEs or a specific CVE, and that will determine what path gets taken and which request is triggered. We're going to create another input, and that's for the case if we're looking for a specific CVE, we want to pass that CVE value, right? So we're going to click the plus sign, and we're going to click text. And we're going to click that again to rename it. And we're just going to call this CVE and click done. And then we'll want to define our output actions. So output actions can be one or more, but they're always going to be event transform actions. And for this one, we want the two actions labeled output. So either returning no results if nothing is found for that vulnerability, or successful results found. Next, we're going to scroll down. This is where we choose what we want to enable it for. Now, it can be enabled for both send a story and Workbench, or just send a story and just Workbench. We're going to enable it just for Workbench. And another thing to note is that when a story is only enabled for Workbench, it does not count towards your licensing. This last option is just for requiring additional confirmation. So prompting the user to confirm before continuing any action, just as an extra layer of security. Okay, that looks good. We can click off there. If we scroll up on the configuration details, one thing I like to point out is the description. There's nothing we need to change here, but this is important for getting or preparing a story for Workbench. We want to provide pretty decent description, again, that provides more context to Workbench to know which story to execute. Now, although these are simulated environments, simulated API responses, we still have to set up authentication for those requests. So to do that, you might notice here on the right-hand side again, our HTTP requests are referencing a Bootcamp _API credential. And if we look here, scroll down, we have that pill that I was talking about, that purple text, but it's not referencing anything because it's not set up yet. We know it's supposed to be credential. So if we click on the empty storyboard and go back and click connect to connect that with an actual value, we're going to create credential. Now, Tines has a bunch of different credential types, most commonly text for things like API keys, but you can use AWS role-based, HTTP requests for grabbing passwords from like a password vault, JSON web tokens for things like Google, OAuth for things like Slack, etc. And then we have these connect flows with tool names. So this basically is a step-by-step kind of guide that prompts you in even the external tool where to generate the API key or create the application, and then how to set that up on the Tines side to make it super easy. So we're going to click text. We're going to keep it the same name. And then we are going to set that value as secret underscore API underscore key. Again, secret underscore API underscore key. And then our next setting is under additional configurations for URLs and domains. So this is essentially a whitelisting. We are specifying the domains that this credential can be used against, and that's going to be our toolkit.tines.com. And then click save. And then now if we go back to those requests in our authorization header and click on that value pill, it is referencing something, but again, because it's a credential, it's hidden. It's never shown in plain text. All right, now that our story is sufficiently ready, we can head over to Workbench and see what that looks like. So to get to Workbench from here, you're gonna go to the upper right-hand corner and you're gonna see a button that looks like a star or like a sparkle, and that you can open Workbench. So Workbench is user scoped, meaning that users can only interact with stories or other components, action templates that they have permissions to interact with, either via like team or tenant level settings. Similar to a storyboard, on our left-hand side, we see templates that we can connect up to credentials, as well as stories. Now for stories, we only see that one Tines Workbench story because we only enabled one for that one. But for templates, there are a bunch of different options here. If you don't see a tool that you want to connect to, it doesn't mean that you can't connect to it. It just means we haven't created a public template. We do have private templates that you can set up and have available for Workbench to use. Now, another thing you might see on our left-hand side, custom instructions. So that is basically additional context that you can pass to the model each time it runs across chats. So a good example I like to provide is, let's say maybe you want Workbench to be more verbose. So let's say you can add some custom instructions that say, hey, each time you respond, make sure to provide additional reasoning for each action, and then estimated time it took you to answer the request. We also have something called presets. So we're looking at all tools right now, but presets can be created by team admins to essentially pre-configure a set of Workbench components. This includes what we talked about: template, stories, credentials, and custom instructions to be available for users in a specific team. So you might want to segment by team, or let's say use case, to make it a little easier in terms of which templates or stories Workbench should utilize in the context of a given use case or team. On our right-hand side, we see options for starting a new chat. And additionally, we also added the ability to connect to Slack via a Slack app. So that means a user doesn't have to be in Tines to interact with Workbench. You can do so via Slack, which is cool. And then in the top, we have our chats. So you can, again, start a new chat or reference older chats. Okay, cool. One last thing we need to do in our stories, we'll want to make sure that one last thing to really enable the story is to make sure this green dot is on. And if you click it, you might get this pop-up that offers to enable disable stories.confirmation. I'm going to do that because I don't want the pop-up anymore. But again, yours might look like this, where it's grayed out. You want to make sure that you click on it and it's enabled green. And this is just another way to help Workbench be more efficient. Again, there's only one story, so pretty self-explanatory which story it should use based on some context that we're giving via the prompts. But let's say you have a bunch of different stories, you can kind of only enable certain ones to cut down on which stories Workbench needs to look through to determine the best fit. All right, let's start chatting. So start typing here. Again, we're talking about vulnerability management. Let's say you have a CVE that you just heard about and you want to quickly search across devices in your CrowdStrike environment if any are affected. So let's say, can you search CrowdStrike for the vulnerability CVE 2025 21298. And all of these prompts will be available or are available in our guide to follow along as well. So again, it knows to reference our enabled story. We have the confirmation on, so I'm going to say confirm. It found a host affected by that vulnerability, and it provided our host information back, nicely formatted, easy to digest, which is really nice. Even gave us a little table. Now, if we wanted to look at the raw JSON, we could click here and we can see our inputs that we define. So passing in the CVE value, and then the query is a specific CVE, and then our output, the raw JSON with the host and the vulnerability data. Might also note we have some recommended prompts to provide to Workbench as the next message. So review the remediation steps, analyze the affected hosts, check the Microsoft update catalog for the patch. Again, yours might look a little different. Okay. So Workbench does a good job at summarizing and condensing and reformatting large amounts of data. Let's try calling that story again, but looking for all open CVs instead of that just specific one, so we have more data to work with. So say search for all open vulnerabilities in CrowdStrike and return the data in table format, and just providing a little more prompting as how I want the data to be formatted. And again, confirm. We'll see this time that it's just passing the query all open CVEs. And then our table format for the open vulnerabilities. And a nice summary. Okay, cool. Now tables are nice, but what if we could take it a step further and make a nice chart? And we can do that because there's also built-in Python functionality within Workbench called Code Analyst. And depending on the more complex kind of data formatting, data transformation, Workbench will know to leverage that internal tool instead of calling out to a story or template. So let's say create a bar chart of the vulnerabilities based on severity. And so it calls Code Analyst. If we take a look here, and again, some of the more complex data transformations do take a little bit longer It might take a little longer than the responsives we've seen previously. So while that executes, I do want to highlight some other cool features. So we do have file support. You can attach, PDFs, images, etc. as context for Workbench to analyze. Oh, there we go. And if we take a look here, we see our Python that was generated. And we have our beautiful bar chart based on severity. Cool. A few other features. There is the rewind feature. So if we hover the top of any message, we can rewind to that message or point in the conversation. Let's say if you want to go in a different direction, the conversation is going, you can rewind. Another cool thing is if we go to our chats here, there is a way to turn a chat interaction with Workbench into a story based on the actions and stories that are executed. And then you can also share stories, making sure that the person that you're showing with does have access to the tenant. All right, now that we have the data, let's go ahead and enrich that original CV a bit more. And to do that, we are going to leverage a template. So go back to the templates on our left, and we're going to search for Tines Bootcamp. And we're going to click Connect. And to make things super easy, it's also going to be using the Bootcamp API. So choose existing credential, Bootcamp API. Once that's set up, we have our options of what actions we can take. We're going to click Get CV Enrichment and close. Then we're going to prompt Workbench to get enrichment data on CV 2025 21298. Also making sure the green dot is lit up here. Confirm. We're passing in our CVE. And we're getting our enrichment data back. Again, this is simulating interacting with something like a recorded future, Microsoft virus total. And it's formatting our response nicely here. I'm just providing more context to that CVE, pretty critical. Versions that it affects, etc. And our link to the security advisory, Microsoft. All right, I think we have all the data that we need. Let's go ahead and create a case. Now, again, if you don't have case management, you'll need to refer to the guide. There's a different step that you'll take, a different story from the story library that allows you to draft or send an email. So draft an email in Workbench and then send it. But we'll be walking through creating a case. So that's going to be an additional template, and that's going to be the Tines template. So we're communicating with the Tines case management API. Now, all of this has been simulated to this point. We're actually going to be calling out to the Tines API here to create a case in our tenant. So we're going to go to our Tines, click Connect, and then we are going to create a new credential. So when you create a new credential, Tines will ask you what kind of API key. Now, the different API keys can be at the tenant level, the service account, team-based, or personal, i.e. tied to your personal permissions. For a live session, everyone should have permissions to their own team to create cases, so personal should be enough. But depending on your own tenant, that might be different. So double check that before creating it. And then click Next. And we can call this Tines Cases API. Click Save. And then once that's set up, we have a bunch of actions to choose from. We only want 2, and that's going to be list teams. Make sure that's checked. And then the other one will be create a case. And that's because for the cases API, we need to have the team ID to be passed in that request. So it's going to require 2 separate requests to create the case. Okay, making sure that's enabled. Now we can open a case. So we're going to prompt Workbench to first look up my team ID and then create a case in my team with markdown tables for the CV and host data. Again, just providing a little more context Workbench of how I want the markdown for cases to look, or to be formatted rather. So again, it's going to do that first request, which is the list teams. And then the second request with the information from the first request to create that case in the right team, the team ID. And now it's generating the description with our markdown tables. And confirm. Looks like it needed to fix something. So sometimes that may happen. May need to do a subsequent request to get the format of the case correct. Confirm. All right, now it's providing a summary of the actions it took and an overview of the case and all of the components of the case that it provided. And even a link to the case. So let's take a look. And now we have a beautiful case, and it even knew to mark it as a critical priority, set as to do. And we have our nicely formatted markdown tables with all the relevant CVE and host data information, remediation steps, and recommended actions. Sweet. And that is it. Congratulations. Thanks for sticking with us to the end. So you are able to enable and interact with a Workbench story and walk through a vulnerability management use case. Just to quickly go over some of the key things that we talked about. So again, enabling story for Workbench, defining input and output actions and input data, setting up credentials, using Workbench to call to different API endpoints, including searching for vulnerabilities across hosts, enriching, formatting data, using Python for graphing, and then creating a case with the Tines API, as well as using templates. We run these boot camps bi-weekly, and they're also available self-paced. The next boot camps or other boot camps we cover are pages and applications and fundamentals. Again, this was Workbench specific, so we didn't really talk much about the actual building, but more of the interactivity with Workbench. But you can see how powerful it can be. We also have certifications and university, again, totally free resources, our story library, which I mentioned a few times, and then our community Slack. Thanks so much for sticking with me, and I hope you learned something. Hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.